Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Jacob Huebert about the costs and destruction of war and the importance of the anti-war position. Mr. Huebert is a libertarian writer and constitutional lawyer. He is the author of Libertarianism Today, which offers an introduction to libertarianism, including the libertarian position on war and peace. You can find him on Facebook under J.H. Huebert and on Twitter at J.H. Huebert. That's at J.H. Huebert. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-peace. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. So let's get started with a discussion of when a war is justified and if a war is ever justified. What are your thoughts on those issues?
Well, a libertarian position on everything is that governments can only do what it would be moral for individuals to do. Governments don't get any special rights just because they're governments. So libertarians think that it's wrong for an individual to steal, for example, so it's wrong for a government to steal, even if it calls it taxation. And libertarians think it's wrong for an individual to kill an innocent person, and therefore it's also wrong for government to kill innocent people, even if it does it in the context of a war, even if it calls it a war. And so a war can only be justified, for one thing, if it doesn't involve killing innocent people. If it's just a defensive war where someone is attacking you or attacking the country, it would be appropriate under libertarianism to defend yourself. But also, you'd have to fund it voluntarily as well, because libertarians, as I just said, don't believe in forcing people to pay taxes, and that's regardless of what you're paying for. Libertarians don't think you can force people to pay money to help the poor, for example, even though that's a very worthy cause. Well, same with defense. Defense is important. It's a very worthy cause, but that still doesn't make it okay to force people to pay for it. So you need to make it only a defensive war, and it needs to be voluntarily funded. I would say those are the two primary criteria that are of importance to libertarians.
So let's talk a bit about the World War II, because that's a war that's often brought up as being a great war that America won that made the world better. So what would your response be to people who say that World War II was completely justified and it was a great thing for us to go in there? I guess the libertarian position for that would be that it wasn't a good thing. So why is that?
Well, it's certainly more complicated than most people make it out to be. And it really, you can't talk about World War II and the justifications for fighting or not fighting in it without going back to World War I. World War I was a war that the U.S. got involved in that it had absolutely no need to be involved in. It was not necessary to defend the United States, to go get involved in some war between a bunch of European countries. And then at the end of World War I, you had very punitive terms imposed on Germany, which a lot of people credit for the rise of Hitler because of the resentment that arose out of the punishment of Germany after World War I. And so you see from the example of World War I how meddling can lead to more bad consequences down the road, and World War II was one of those bad consequences. Now, of course, Hitler was as bad as can be and certainly deserved to be overthrown and to have his government destroyed. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was okay to force U.S. taxpayers to pay for a war against Hitler, or that it was necessary for the U.S. to get into that war to defend its interests. Of course, Germany did not attack the United States, and Japan only attacked the United States after FDR had taken certain steps that sort of were intended to entice Japan into attacking the United States. Now, of course, Japan was an aggressive country. It, too, had an evil government that should have been overthrown, but that doesn't mean it was okay for the U.S. to force people to pay for it. It doesn't mean it was okay for the U.S. to go kill innocent Japanese people in fighting against Japan. Certainly, it wasn't justified in killing some 200,000 people with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that would be true even if we view Japan as an aggressor in attacking the United States. That doesn't mean it would be okay to respond to that aggression in the way that the U.S. did, which involved, of course, the only nuclear attacks in world history, and also involved bombing raids on civilians that killed some 100,000 people in Tokyo, for example. So World War II is complicated, but certainly the way the U.S. fought against these powers was not justified under libertarianism. And by the way, World War II also brought in a lot of other bad things that go along with war. It had a lot of negative consequences for the United States. Of course, there was widespread conscription, which just amounts to enslaving people and forcing them to go perform basically the worst job there is, where you're either you're being forced to kill people or perhaps being killed yourself. And that, of course, takes away the men who are drafted from their families and makes their lives worse. The U.S. at the same time imposed economic controls at home, price controls, rationing. All of that was very bad for the U.S. economy and the people who were living here while the soldiers went over to fight the war. So World War II had many bad consequences for the U.S. And so certainly the way the U.S. fought that war was not justified.
Well, and of course, it also increased Stalin's power in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, and led to the rise of Mao Zedong in China. So even looking abroad, there are even more negative consequences than just what took place within the actual years of the war.
Right. And, it's hard to predict what would have happened if, say, the U.S. had not gotten involved in that war. Pat Buchanan has a book written for sort of a popular audience on this topic. And, of course, he's not a libertarian, but he asks interesting questions and offers some interesting thoughts on how the Nazi regime might have been defeated anyway, even if the U.S. hadn't gotten involved in with the U.S. With the Nazis and the Soviets fighting each other. Maybe both of those regimes could have worn down and wouldn't have had the Soviet Union dominating Eastern Europe for all those years, and all those people suffering under communism in Russia for all those years.
Well, in one topic that Pat Buchanan addresses, and no conversation about World War II, I guess, can really go on without bringing this up, but that's the Holocaust. A lot of people will argue that American intervention, American involvement in that war was necessary because of the Holocaust. How would you respond to that?
Well, certainly Jews were being badly persecuted in Germany at the time the U.S. got into World War II. There's no question about that. But if the U.S. wanted to help Jews in Germany and other countries occupied by the Nazis, it could have one thing it could have done would be to let Jews into this country. But that's not what we did. Instead, when there were Jews who wanted to flee Nazi Germany and come into the United States, they were literally here on a boat, and we sent them away. We didn't send them away. Roosevelt sent them away. And so if it's hard to justify World War II on humanitarian grounds when we could have been humanitarian before getting involved in the war. So why not try that? Why not try every peaceful means of evacuating Jews from Europe before going to war? And of course, as Buchanan points out, the death camps didn't really get going until late in the war. So that couldn't have justified U.S. entry into the war because it wasn't happening yet. And of course, the U.S. entry into the war didn't stop it from happening. Hitler still succeeded in killing, most of the Jews, killing millions and millions of Jews. So it's hard to use that as a justification for the U.S. fighting World War II.
And another thing that a lot of people bring up when the topic of World War II is brought up is the fact that, World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. So can we squash some of those myths and other myths that seem to say that war creates economic growth and that war creates wealth somehow instead of destroying it.
Yeah, the idea that war could create economic prosperity is just absurd because with a war, you have government taking money through taxation or other means out of the productive sector of the economy so that instead of producing things that consumers want that benefits consumers, instead you have companies producing just stuff for war, bombs and things that they're going to blow up and use for destructive ends. And so when you're producing less things for private citizens to consume, you, of course, have less prosperity. And when you're taxing people to pay for all this, that harms your prosperity. You could observe that unemployment went down with World War II but that's largely because you were drafting all these people. And slavery is a full employment program, but it's a bad one. It's not desirable to have a job just for the sake of having one. If it's a very low-paying job that you can't quit, that could get you killed or maimed or inflict terrible psychological trauma on you by forcing you to do terrible things and see terrible things. So this notion that war can lead to prosperity is absurd in the same way that any other suggestion that government spending creates prosperity is absurd.
Well, and of course, if you take a quarter of the workforce out of the workforce, then unemployment numbers are going to go down. And if you have factories working on war weapons and munitions and war technology, then government spending is going to go up. And since that's a component of GDP will go up. So while unemployment numbers and GDP numbers might look better, there's no real prosperity coming out of those things.
Right, and it just goes to show that GDP is a bad measure of prosperity, especially if you're counting government spending. Now, of course, there are some sectors of the economy that benefit from wars. The companies that make the planes and bombs and everything else, that they prosper in wartime, and that's why you see those companies, defense contractors or merchants of death, as they're appropriately called, always pushing for more war, even now.
All right, and we'll return to that topic in a moment, but I want to take a step back to whether past wars were justified. Even amongst those of us who would agree that World War II and World War I and the Spanish-American War, and you can go on down the list, were not justified, there are still those who will say that the American Revolution was justified, or here in Texas might point to the Texas Revolution. What's your take on the justification of the American Revolution?
Well, on the surface, it does seem like the kind of war that libertarians would support because you had a government occupying the United States the colonies that the people wanted to cast off. And if you directed that war at that government, you declare independence, tell them you don't want them here anymore, and if they stay, you're going to fight them. That would seem to be appropriate from a libertarian perspective. But if you look into it in a little more depth, you can see that it was not always fought in a libertarian way. You did have conscription. You did have people being forced to pay for it. And so I believe Jeffrey Rogers Hummel has written something on that, which I cite in the chapter of my book on war, or if you Google him and war and the revolution, you can probably find it online. And it's worth reading to see that even the so-called best wars really are very problematic from a libertarian perspective. And by the way, it's not necessarily obvious that we're necessarily freer because of the Revolutionary War. If you look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, Canada sometimes, I don't know, maybe always, I'm not sure, does better than us. So for all that, what do we have to show for it? Maybe we could have peacefully achieved our independence like so many other British colonies did. But in any event, that doesn't justify killing any an innocent person to the extent that happened through collateral damage or conscription or any of those other things.
Well, on the question of whether we're freer, there are some who point out that after the Constitution was adopted, taxes in the U.S. were at least 3 times higher than they were under the rule of King George.
Yeah, and of course they're a lot higher than that now too.
Yeah.
I'd still rather live here than in England, given their current government, which isn't very good. But I'm glad America is independent. But that doesn't mean that the Revolutionary War was fully justified in the way that it was fought. Perhaps it could have just been fought and won through legitimate means, but in fact, it wasn't.
And another thing I thought of about just the complete waste in spending on weapons is, it gets even worse when they use the weapons, even if you're not using the weapons on yourself, right? I mean, if you bomb all of Tokyo, right, that's one person less you have to trade with. So, I mean, just creating and using weapons hurts everyone involved. And to continue on with some of the consequences of war, we've seen lots of government programs come about from wars where they say, okay, well, we're just going to do this right now, and once the war's over, we're going to stop doing it. And obviously, it never stops after the war. Can you give us some examples of programs and expansions of government during wars that have continued after wars?
Sure. A great example from World War II is income tax withholding. The free market economist Milton Friedman actually worked for the government at that time and was not so free market at that early point in his career, and was actually involved in proposing this, thinking that it would be just a temporary measure to help the U.S. win the war. Before World War II, your tax bill just came due, and you wrote a check to pay for it. When the income tax withholding came in, then the government started taking the money out of your check every time you were paid. So you never saw the money in the first place. So the government could have it sooner. And so the government could enjoy the value of that money sooner, instead of you getting the value of that money between the time that you earn it and the time that your tax bill comes due. You could, if the government didn't withhold it, you could, for example, be earning interest on that money, but the government takes it sooner, so you can't. And that's bad in multiple ways. It's bad for the reason I just said, because you're deprived of that. But it's also bad because it means that people don't feel the pain of taxation as much. If it's never in your account to begin with, you don't feel the pain as much when it's not there. If you had to write a check for the full amount every April 15th, people would be a lot more upset about their tax burden. But the government, and that's how it's played out. The government didn't get rid of this after World War II, and so now people are just used to having the money come out of their checks. They don't feel that pain of taxation quite as strongly, and instead of writing a big check on April 15th, maybe they get a refund check, which makes them feel like the government's doing them a favor, which is, of course, ridiculous, but that's how the psychology works. And so that would seem to have nothing to do with war on the surface, but we have it only because of war. Another thing that happened in World War II was the government set maximum wages that people in certain jobs could be paid. And to work around that, employers started giving people health benefits which didn't count against that maximum wage. So health benefits, health insurance became part of your compensation package during World War II. And then that held on through the present day. And our way of paying for healthcare this way, where it's bundled with employment and you do it with insurance, has created lots of problems in our current healthcare system, where people don't have to shop between doctors based on what they charge, and that's caused costs to go up. Again, doesn't seem to have anything to do with war, but for World War II, we might well not have that. And our healthcare system might look very different and might be a lot better.
Well, and this seems to really be a theme throughout American history, whether it be the War of 1812 or the Mexican-American War or the Civil War or World War I or World War II or the Cold War. And we're seeing, of course, a lot of this with the War on Terror, where you have these conflicts and the government intervenes. And even when they intervene in ways that are not 100% directly related to the war, these programs are in place, and oftentimes they're not repealed when the war is over, and we're stuck with the consequences after that.
Well, right. Just like with the war on terror, you bring in something like the Patriot Act and all kinds of spying that the government can do on people, supposedly to fight the war on terror. But we see over time they get these tools that are justified by the war on terror, but then they start using them for other things like domestic crimes involving drugs and things like that. So the police state grows bigger domestically as a result of foreign wars as well. And of course, Robert Higgs writes about all of this in his great book, Crisis and Leviathan. He describes a ratchet effect where government takes advantage of a crisis, such as a war or an economic crisis, to grab a whole bunch of new powers for itself that it claims it needs to fight that crisis. And then once the crisis is over, those powers don't all go away. Some of them do, but the government has more power than it did before the crisis happened. And Higgs observes that this has just gone up and up and up through U.S. history, and wars are a big part of that story.
One thing that occurs during wars often that hasn't occurred in recent years is conscription. And we've already talked about how it's really a form of slavery. So tell us a bit more about conscription, how it's been used in the past, and do you think it could be used today or in the future? Or do you think people would rise up and be opposed to such a thing?
Well, conscription has been a part of war in the U.S. since the Revolution on a relatively small scale there, but then you had it on a much larger scale over time. In the Civil War, of course, we had conscription, and then into World War I and World War II, you had conscription, and you had people who object to conscription, conscientious objectors, people who are pacifists because of their religious beliefs, say, very seriously abused. And it is just a system of mass slavery that could greatly change our culture by putting a bunch of people into a war situation that could sort of change their values and worst of all, of course, get them killed. So it's a terrible thing, and fortunately, we don't have it, and we have Milton Friedman to blame for income tax withholding, but we have Milton Friedman to thank for ending the draft during the Nixon administration, when Nixon put together a group of people to consider whether it was a good idea to get rid of the draft. Milton Friedman was there, and he played a big role in that discussion in convincing the others that this was the right thing to do, and that even from the government's perspective, it'd be better to have an all-volunteer army. That might have a little bit of a negative consequence in taking away the resistance to war that the draft creates. Like in Vietnam, of course, people are going to get much more upset about it if there's a risk that they're going to be forced to go fight in it. And when you take that away, then war maybe seems a little more like somebody else's problem. Nonetheless, of course, it's much better that we don't have conscription anymore and we don't have people being forced into this type of slavery. I think it certainly could come back simply because historically it has been used so much. On the other hand, it's difficult to imagine young people today accepting that. Even people who aren't very politically engaged otherwise, who are focused on material concerns or whatever, I mean, they could become much more politically engaged if there's suddenly this threat of themselves being sent over into a situation where they could be killed. I just think there would be so much protest of that today by the people who would be drafted. It would be hard to pull off, especially since government, fortunately, is losing legitimacy in people's eyes. People don't feel that blind loyalty to the government that maybe they did more in past times. So I do think it will be hard to bring it back. But of course, we have to be vigilant against it. And we should be vigilant against it in other forms, too, because we hear proposals for national service where maybe you're not forced into the military, but you're forced to do something else that the government thinks would be good for the country. And while whatever those things are, community service or whatever, might not be as bad as being forced to go to a war, it's still slavery and still highly objectionable from a libertarian perspective. I think that's the biggest threat right now as far as any kind of conscription coming back.
Well, and there are still politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, who talk about bringing back some form of conscription. Chuck Hagel, I think, has talked about this, and I think Charlie Rangel. So sadly, this issue hasn't gone away.
Yeah, I think it's a benefit of maybe the millennial entitlement mentality that they would consider themselves entitled to not have to go fight in a war. So we at least have we have that going for us now, and I think that's going to. I hope that's going to outweigh any politicians' ideas that conscription would be good.
Yeah, let's hope so. So I want to return to sort of the immorality of war. There are a lot of horrible things that come out of war, some of which include, mass killings, destruction of communities, broken families, property destruction, illnesses, and then, of course, you have the effects on those who then return home from war. So can you go into a little more sort of these negative effects of war and the human costs of war?
Well, I mean, you've done a good job of kind of running down the list. You have families, of course, at home that are torn apart by losing a father or a son, and you have, of course, families that are destroyed in these other countries. And really, when the war is debated in the U.S., it's almost always stated in terms of costs and benefits to people in the U.S. Well, it would be expensive for people in the U.S., and it would be bad to have people's family members who are in the military sent over to fight these wars. And that's all very true, and it's something that we certainly should talk about. But it's important to think about what these wars do to the other countries where you inevitably have many, many innocent people being killed. The numbers for the Iraq war are debatable, but it's not really debatable that you've had hundreds of thousands of deaths that you wouldn't have otherwise had in Iraq because of our war, and also because of U.S. foreign policy generally. You don't even need a war for interventionist foreign policy to kill a lot of people. During the 1990s, for example, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iraq, and it's estimated that those sanctions cost at least 350,000 excess deaths of Iraqi men, women, and children who were innocent, who weren't fighting in a war, but just couldn't get what they needed to survive because the U.S. Was preventing it. And so interventionist foreign policy is devastating to the countries that it targets, and that should count for a lot. Libertarians don't, unlike it seems, the politicians of both parties don't value American lives over other lives. We think every human life has equal worth. And so those foreign lives that are lost are a terrible cost, really the most important cost, and reason enough to not be fighting these wars. But as you say, and the death doesn't necessarily come from being shot or being blown up by a bomb. It could be because we're stopping supplies from getting in, and so or stopping medicine from getting in. There's lots of ways that U.S. foreign policy is destructive to these other countries.
Well, and of course, we've also seen millions of refugees come out of U.S. foreign policy and involvement in the Middle East.
Well, right. Of course, that's the most vivid illustration right now, where you wreck all these countries and these people can't be there anymore and they need somewhere to go. And of course, you have the latest trend is to take out a dictator like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. And then what happens in those countries? You don't have enlightened governments taking their place, but you have worse Islamic governments taking their place. And as a result, you have lots of oppression going on in those countries, and conditions aren't better, which illustrates the folly of the neocon idea that you can use war to spread liberal democracy and liberal democratic values. Well, just because you blow up some dictator's tyrannical government doesn't mean that's going to happen. And there's absolutely no reason to think that it would happen, given the history and culture of these countries. So it's terribly reckless to go around killing dictators simply because they're bad guys who deserve to die. And we can concede that they do deserve to die, but that doesn't mean it makes sense. It's a good thing to take them out because of these consequences that could ensue. Even if you don't think about the U.S. directly killing innocent people, even destroying these governments can have bad consequences, and does, as we see playing out in Libya and Iraq and all over.
And we often hear folks say, we've got to be a leader, right? We've got to be a leader around the world. And I think that's kind of a false idea that you have to engage in war in order to be a world leader. Are there any examples of governments or countries that are successful first world countries that do not engage in lots of wars, and how has it gone for them?
Well, sure. I mean, the U.S. ropes a lot of other countries into its wars, like Canada and the U.K. and so on. But would make no sense to say that you have to have war to be a successful country. I mean, Japan is an economically prosperous country. Its economy took off after World War II as it rebuilt, and its pacifism is written into its constitution. They haven't gotten involved in any intervention at all, and they've just minded their own business, and they've become a very wealthy country. They've had some bad economic policies that have set them back lately, but even so, their prosperity certainly isn't attributable to any foreign intervention on their part since they started taking off. And you have a country's it's economic freedom that tends to make a country prosperous. So if you look at the countries that have the most economic freedom and therefore are the most prosperous, a lot of them don't go around starting wars. You have a place like Hong Kong became very successful, even though it was surrounded by communist China, because it had capitalism. It didn't have to go to war with China to be prosperous. It just minded its own business and prospered.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like Japan's pacifist tendencies may be changing soon. But I want to ask you about the notion of peace through strength. We've heard Donald Trump talk about this a lot. Of course, this is often associated with Ronald Reagan and any number of figures, particularly in the U.S., where if you build up the military and make it very strong, then that brings about peace. What do you think of that claim? Because that doesn't seem to have a lot of merit as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I mean, the U.S. hasn't had peace. The U.S. uses this military to go around starting wars. So you haven't actually had peace. It's true that you don't have anybody attacking the U.S. You just have the U.S. going out and aggressing. But that doesn't mean that you peace through strength. I'm not sure what that means, but it doesn't mean that you need an interventionist foreign policy. If you're the kind of libertarian who is a minarchist and thinks it's appropriate for government to do national defense, well, then you can favor having the resources in place to defend the country. But that doesn't mean you have an interventionist foreign policy, and it doesn't mean you go out starting wars. And if you mind your own business and have a free economy, then the country is going to be going to become wealthy. And if there ever is an attack, whether you have a standing military or not, and I would argue you don't need a standing military, then you're going to be able to mobilize the resources to defend against it. But that really hasn't been an issue for the U.S. because there really isn't anybody out there trying to attack the U.S. Except where the U.S. has been meddling in other countries' business. So if you leave them alone, that seems like the best way to not get them to want to attack you.
One of the biggest victims of war are the troops who are sent there, because they often come home and often they can't find a job. They have mental problems that were derived from the wars. And a lot of times whenever you claim that you're anti-war, people claim that you're against the troops. And I think that's really the opposite of the truth. So can you go into a bit more on why it is so difficult, especially for the troops in these wars?
Well, it's difficult because they are expected to do terrible things as part of their job. They're expected to subject themselves to being killed and to kill others. And often this entails killing innocent people. So, of course, that's going to be psychologically traumatizing. And, of course, you have people not only being killed, but being maimed and so on, or seeing these things happen to their friends. And, of course, that's going to be psychologically traumatic. And so then you see these people coming home and they have post-traumatic stress disorder that makes their lives miserable. And you have a very high rate of suicide among people who have come back from war.
So I think when we add up everything that comes out of war and when we look at war from all different angles, it really proves how true Randolph Bourne's line, war is the health of the state. It shows how true that line really is.
Well, right. It gives the state the excuse to control the economy. It gives the state the excuse to put in new police state type measures, and it gives it new excuses to control speech. We've seen terrible restrictions on speech in U.S. history. We haven't touched on that in World War I, for example. And we think about conservatives and maybe some libertarians act as though the U.S. used to have a great love for liberty and our constitutional rights, and it's only with Obama or Bush, say, that we're really seeing our constitutional rights go away. But really, in the early 20th century, you had terrible disregard for people's constitutional rights, starting especially with World War I, where people who made even the mildest sort of criticisms of the war or the government were put in jail. You had a filmmaker who made a movie called Spirit of 76, which actually didn't criticize the U.S. government. It celebrated the American Revolution and showed the Americans fighting the British in kind of a violent, sensationalistic way. And the filmmaker was actually prosecuted for this film because it supposedly stirred up anti-German sentiment, anti-British sentiment, and the British were supposed to be our allies during World War I, so it was bad to be putting this out there and making people think worse of the British, which is just crazy, and people were put in jail for this sort of thing.
Well, and there was also an enormous anti-German hysteria during World War I, and of course World War II anti-Japanese hysteria, and to a lesser degree anti-German and Italian hysteria, and internment camps as well.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, you had the Japanese internment, which is an atrocious thing, but that's the war hysteria leads people, and created by war propaganda leads people to go for these things, which is why it's so dangerous. Suddenly, when you have war as the excuse, people will go for just every unconscionable thing.
All right, well, on that note, let's talk about the current state of the anti-war movement before we wrap up. How would you describe the current state of the anti-war movement? What opposition do we see, not just from libertarians, but also on the left and the right? And what can someone do to really push back against the war state?
Well, the situation is pretty terrible. We had a big anti-war movement when George W. Bush was president. And then, of course, when Barack Obama became president, it all seemed to evaporate. Now, I don't want to say that it totally went away, because there are those dedicated people. People like Cindy Sheehan, for example, who have stayed with it all the way and keep pushing back against it. But the big movement, the big protest that we saw went away when Obama became president, and hasn't come back because most people on the left, most Democrat types, turn a blind eye to Democrat presidents' wars, or at least they turn their focus to other things they want to accomplish that are on their agenda, and they ignore the war issue. And meanwhile, the right is not of much use either. You have some paleo-conservatives, traditionalist conservatives, who are consistently anti-war under Republican and Democrat administrations. But for the most part, you don't see Republicans and conservatives criticizing Obama for continuing the Iraq war, for intervening in Libya. Instead, what you see is criticizing him for not intervening enough and waging even more war as they wish he would do. So it's a really bad situation, and I'm concerned that it's going to get even worse with a Hillary Clinton presidency, because of course the left is going to allow the first woman president to get away with murder, literally, in waging whatever war she wants to know. And we know from Hillary Clinton's record that she wants to wage a lot of war. And again, I don't know that conservatives are going to oppose that. They'll probably complain about the way that she goes about it, but they're not opposed to war in principle. And so it's doubtful we'll see much of an anti-war movement arising against that. So it's really going to be a worst case scenario, because I don't think Obama is that much of a warmonger. I don't think he loves war. I don't think he wants to wage lots of wars. To his credit, he didn't get us into a war in Syria despite a lot of pressure to do so. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, really does want more war. And so I think we're going into, unfortunately, worse times for those of us who oppose war, and of course, most of all, the victims of the wars that the U.S. is going to wage. So that just leaves, that leaves the principled liberals and conservatives, the relative few, and it leaves libertarians to push back against this. And so it's important for libertarians to put this high on their list of priorities. It's on the left's list of priorities, but they put it very far down. They put same-sex marriage and abortion and a million other things ahead of this. So we have to make it a top priority because nobody else is doing it. How do you do that effectively? Well, that's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to resist the U.S. war machine. Maybe the sort of populism that's in the air as a result of Bernie Sanders, and to some extent, you have to admit, as a result of Trump, could lead to some to people pushing back against this. If people see lots of troops being sent overseas, and people start losing more sons and daughters in war, maybe there'll be popular resistance. But I'm not sure how strategically to go about opposing that. But it's very important that we find ways to do it.
Well, it's an extremely important issue, and we're really happy that you could come on and speak with us today. Thank you so much.
And I should say one more thing. For libertarians or anyone who's concerned about opposing war, the place to go for all the best information is antiwar.com, a website founded and run by libertarians that is relentless in criticizing all the administrations in all of their warmongering. Look to the writers there and their ideas on how we should push back against the warfare state, because they really are the best on this.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. And I know we've mentioned a lot of this over the course of the interview, but can you go over again some recommended readings for those who would like to learn more about this topic, and also where people can follow your work?
Oh, sure. So if you want kind of a general overview of the libertarian position on war, I have a chapter in that in my book, Libertarianism Today, but you don't have to buy the book. It's actually online. This chapter is actually online for free at antiwar.com. There it's titled Libertarianism is Anti-War. So if you Google that title, that'll come right up and give you the basic overview of the libertarian position and views on the different wars throughout history from a libertarian perspective. So if you want something quick, you could look at that. I mentioned Robert Higgs' book, Crisis in Leviathan. That's a very important book that I recommend to everybody about the growth of government, especially as a result of wars. There's a book edited by John Denson called The Costs of War that has essays, mostly by libertarian scholars, that talks about the different wars in U.S. history and why they have been costly and unnecessary and unlibertarian. Ron Paul has a collection of essays on war called A Foreign Policy of Freedom that's worth reading. So I'd suggest maybe start with those things and go to antiwar.com and read things there, and those writers will lead you to other resources as well. And if you want perspectives on like the war on terror in particular, and refuting, want to know how to refute the idea that we need to fight the war on terror to stop terrorists from killing us, in that essay of mine that I mentioned, there's a number of references to books in there that address those points.
All right, and how about the best ways to follow your work?
Oh, that's right. Well, I don't use Twitter as much as I'd like, but hopefully I'll start up again soon, and you can follow me there at twitter.com/jhubert. That's JHHUEBERT. You can do the same thing on Facebook, facebook.com/JHHUEBERT. And that's really those are the ways really to follow what's going on. If I have a new article or a new thing I'm doing, that's where to see it.
All right, well, very good. And I want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-peace, and we will link to everything we've discussed today. So Libertarianism Today, we'll link to that particular chapter of Libertarianism Today. We'll link to Crisis in Leviathan. We'll link to, there's an essay that Murray Rothbard wrote on some of the growth of government that's taken place through different wars. So we'll link to that.
Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned that. That's a great essay, which everyone should read.
Yes. So we'll link to that. And we did an episode of the show with John Denson, so that will be on there. as along with the Twitter and Facebook pages. So everything related to this episode, go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/war-peace, and you can find it all right there. And I also want to encourage everybody to follow us on Twitter. @WUC Podcast is the handle for that. So please follow us. And on that note, Jacob, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun, and hopefully we can speak with you again sometime soon.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.